There's a specific date historians rarely talk about, not because it wasn't important, but because on that day, nothing seemed to happen at all. September 3rd, 476 AD, the sun rose over Rome exactly as it had for over 1,000 years. The markets opened. Merchants haggled over the price of olive oil. Children played in the fountains. Senators walked the marble corridors debating tax policy and trade routes. If you had asked anyone in the city whether this was the day the world ended, they would have laughed at you. And that's exactly why it was. The Roman Empire didn't fall with a bang. It fell with a whisper so quiet that the people living through it couldn't even hear it. They went to bed in an empire and woke up in ruins, and most of them never noticed the difference. This is the story of the invisible moment the world ended, and how an entire civilization sleepwalked into oblivion while convinced they were still invincible. Let me take you back further, to understand what Rome looked like when it still believed in itself. Picture the year 450 AD, Rome is still Rome. The Colosseum still stands, weathered but magnificent. The aqueducts still bring fresh water from the mountains. The Forum still echoes with the voices of politicians and philosophers. Walk through the Suburra district at dawn and you'd smell fresh bread baking, fish from Ostia being unloaded, the sharp temps of wine from the taverns that never really closed. The wealthy still recline on couches inlaid with ivory, still commission statues of themselves in heroic poses, still throw parties where peacock tongues are served on silver platters. If you were a Roman citizen of means, your life was comfortable beyond measure. Your slaves handled everything. Your money, mostly inherited, seemed infinite. The barbaroi beyond the borders were a distant problem, something the army dealt with, nothing that would ever touch you personally. Rome had survived 1,000 crises. It had survived civil wars, plagues, mad emperors, and invasion attempts. Why would this time be any different? But here's what almost nobody was watching. Here's the invisible detail that was killing Rome while everyone admired the marble. The currency was dying. For centuries, Roman denarii had been made of pure silver, the backbone of the greatest economy the world had ever seen. But starting in the 3rd century, emperors facing constant wars and needing to pay armies began a quiet crime. They started mixing the silver with cheaper metals, just a little at first. 10% copper, nobody would notice. Then 20, then 50. By the year 300, coins that were supposed to be silver were 90% copper and tin, with just a thin wash of silver on the outside to maintain the illusion. The government was counterfeiting its own money, debasing the very foundation of Roman wealth. And here's the thing, people did notice. Merchants started weighing coins. They started refusing old currency. Prices began to skyrocket as the money became worthless. A loaf of bread that cost 1 denarius in 250 AD cost 10,000 denarii by 350 AD. But the Romans didn't see this as a systemic collapse. They saw it as temporary inflation, a rough patch, something the next emperor would fix. They kept conducting business as usual, kept building monuments, kept importing silk from China and spices from India, kept maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. Meanwhile, the legions were changing. Once, Roman soldiers were citizens, property owners with skin in the game, men fighting for their own land and families. By the 5th century, the armies were mostly Germanic mercenaries, foederati, foreigners hired to defend borders they had no emotional connection to. These men were paid in that same worthless currency. When the money stopped coming, or came but couldn't buy anything, why would they fight? Why would they die for an empire that was just an employer who paid in fake coins? The borders began to dissolve, not through dramatic battles but through quiet desertions, through soldiers simply walking away from their posts because there was no point in staying. The frontier became porous. Barbarian tribes didn't so much invade as drift across borders that no longer really existed, moving into lands that nobody was defending anymore. And still, in Rome itself, the elite were confident. The Senate still met. Laws were still passed. Aqueducts were still maintained, though perhaps not as well as before. If a fountain stopped working, well, there were other fountains. If a road fell into disrepair, there were other roads. Each small failure was isolated, explainable, fixable later. Nobody connected the dots. Nobody saw that the accumulated weight of 1,000 small failures was buckling the entire structure. The Roman aristocracy had inherited their wealth and status. They'd never built anything themselves. They had no idea how complex systems actually worked, how much continuous effort and resources were required to maintain an empire. They thought Rome ran on its own momentum, that it was permanent, that their lifestyle was the natural order of things. September 3rd, 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who had been serving as a Roman general, walked into the palace and told the teenage Emperor Romulus Augustulus that his services were no longer required. There was no battle, no siege, no dramatic last stand. The emperor, a child who'd been installed by his father less than a year earlier, simply took off his purple robes and was sent to live in a villa with a pension. Odoacer declared himself king of Italy. The Western Roman Empire ceased to exist, and in the streets of Rome, nothing changed. The markets still opened the next morning. People still bought bread and wine. The aqueducts still flowed. Life continued exactly as it had the day before. Most Romans didn't even know the empire had ended. There was no announcement, no public ceremony marking the transition. The imperial bureaucracy just became Odoacer's bureaucracy. The tax collectors still came around. The laws stayed mostly the same. It would take decades before people really understood that something fundamental had shifted, that they were no longer living in the Roman Empire but in its ghost. Here's what haunts me about this story. The Romans had every warning sign. They watched their currency become worthless. They saw their borders collapse. They witnessed corruption consume every institution. They felt the quality of life declining year by year. And they did nothing, because each individual decline was small enough to rationalize, to explain away, to assume would reverse itself. They couldn't imagine that Rome could actually end, so they didn't see it ending even as it happened right in front of them. They confused the appearance of stability with actual stability. They looked at the marble buildings still standing, and assumed the civilization was still standing too, not understanding that buildings outlast the cultures that build them. Now look around you today. Look at the currency being printed in quantities that would make a Roman emperor blush. Look at the infrastructure slowly crumbling. Look at institutions losing credibility and authority. Look at the absolute confidence of the people at the top that everything is fine, that the system is stable, that this is all temporary and manageable. Are we watching our own empire die in slow motion while convincing ourselves it's all normal? The thing about silent collapses is that they're only silent to the people living through them. Future historians will look back at our era and wonder how we missed all the signs. They'll ask why we didn't act when we still had time. And the answer will be the same as it was for Rome. We couldn't hear the end of our world because it didn't make any noise. It just stopped, quietly, while we were all too busy to notice.